44 years before COVID-19, the BBC made a post-apocalyptic drama about a world ravaged by a virus that had been released in a Chinese lab accident. Its name? Survivors. So there are 38 episodes of Survivors. It ran across 3 seasons from 1975 to 1977. And the protagonist in the first season, the main protagonist at least, is a woman, Abby Grant, played by Carolyn Seymour.
Gosh, that sounds exciting.
Now, Abby is quite a well-to-do lady. She lives in a very nice house with her husband, played by Peter Bowles, in a very nice village on the outskirts of London. Her son Peter is at boarding school, and everything's going swimmingly for her until reports start coming through of this strange sickness that's affecting other parts of the world. Before you know it, the hospitals are just filling up with desperate people, and there's nothing anyone can do for them.
I mean, we're snowed under.
This event will come to be known as the death. Abby gets the fever for a while. She sleeps for several days. If this was real life, she'd die of thirst, but it's fiction, so she doesn't. And when she wakes up, she goes into the living room, and poor old Peter Bowles is dead on the couch. It turns out Abby is one of the very few people with natural immunity, and the population of England has been reduced to several thousand. From this point on, Survivors is largely set in the countryside. It becomes more pastoral as it goes along, in fact. The cities are full of typhoid and cholera and rats that hunt people down in packs. What I find fascinating is that it becomes a rather profound meditation on the nature of humanity and the fragility of civilization. In the first episode, one of the characters asks, how do you build a modern consumer good from scratch?
That. Could you make that? Where does the raw material come from? Do you know?
You can't. There's too many links along the supply chain, from mining the raw material to the various manufacturing processes. And anyway, the skills will have been lost in a disaster like this. It's incredibly thought-provoking stuff from Terry Nation, the series deviser apparently, who made his millions creating the Daleks in the early days of Doctor Who, and has a reputation as a hack writer. Well, I think of him as a hack writer, to be honest, but there's nothing wrong with that. He entertained millions of people, and along the way he created moments of TV magic. I think he did that with Survivors, although I have to say he might have stolen the idea from his colleague Brian Clemens, producer of The Avengers, not Marvel Avengers, the other one. Clemens sued Terry Nation till they both got tired of paying legal fees, so we'll never know the truth of the matter. But whatever the case, I think Survivors is Terry Nation's best work because it deals so adroitly with so many aspects of human existence. There's agriculture, there's animal husbandry, there's industrial relations, which was a big thing in 1970s Britain, working with people that you don't get on with. There's law and order. In fact, there's an episode of that name where a woman is murdered and they set up a kangaroo court to deal with the person they think has done it. There's religion. Do human beings need a higher power to believe in, a supreme being? Or are they going to say in a situation like this, well, what sort of God is going to wipe most of us out?
Well, where was God in the plague?
Man made the plague.
There's politics. Some communities are pretty much fascist paramilitary groups, and others are more social democratic or have Marxist principles. How do they compare? One episode deals with women's rights. You know, in a situation where you're almost at extinction level, is the primary purpose of women to have babies and rear children? It's getting into Handmaid's Tale territory at this point.
What?
An attractive young woman like Ruth, repressing all her natural instincts for her work, it's absurd.
There's a thread running through the whole programme. The stakes can't be any higher. If we get this wrong, the species is going to die out. A criticism that's levelled at 70s survivors is that it's too white and middle class. That's middle class in the British sense of affluent professionals. I don't think either of those criticisms is really warranted. First of all, it was made in the 1970s and it pretty much reflected the lack of diversity that there was in Britain at that time. As for the middle class thing, well, if the main characters had been a marketing consultant and a stockbroker, then fair enough. But it's not quite like that. The two men who end up jostling for the position of top dog are Greg Preston, played by Ian McCulloch, who wrote 3 of the episodes. He's an engineer. And the second guy is Charles Vaughan, played by Dennis Lill. He's an architect and a bit of a grow-your-own enthusiast, which was another big thing in the 70s. These are practical people with something to offer. Yes, you have a businessman who somehow manages to adapt to the new world, even though he's a kind of finance guy. And yes, some of the working class characters are a bit broad. There's one in particular, Tom Price, who was a buck-toothed Welsh tramp who's always getting into trouble and is rather sinister. But the point is made over and over that everybody has value to the community, and if you're good at digging ditches, that could mean the difference between having enough food to eat and not having enough food to eat. It's a bit like when we had lockdown and the supermarket workers and the HGV drivers and the refuse collectors and so on were the people who kept society going. So, towards the end of the show, they are re-establishing things like railways and hydroelectric power and communications, and we learn in the last episode that actually the Scots outnumber the English now, because a lot of them lived in isolated highland communities rather than in cities, and only 90% of Scottish people died, as opposed to whatever it is, 98-99% of English people. And that was that. We left the story there. But the story of Survivors as a franchise didn't end there, because there were 3 failed attempts and 1 successful attempt to bring it back. First of all, Terry Nation moved to America and tried to sell the idea to the networks over there. This would be a completely new series set in America, in which Abby Grant, this time, would travel across the country in a kind of convoy on her way to sunny Los Angeles, where her son was meant to be if he'd survived. And she'd meet various communities, disparate communities, along the way. This didn't happen because Terry Nation wasn't a known quantity in America, essentially. But then Ian McCulloch tried to revive it in the late 80s and mid-90s, I think. Not much is known about his second attempt, but he essentially wanted to create a 4th BBC season of the show, years after it had ended. His first idea was that black Africans would invade the UK. I'm sure he had the best of intentions. It would have been an interesting reversal of the idea of European colonialism, and it would have given work to actors of colour. But the BBC, not surprisingly, I have to say, turned around and said, sounds a bit iffy, Ian. The other thing was there'd been no example of a successful BBC series being revived in that way until, in 2005, Russell T Davies brought back Doctor Who to great acclaim and huge viewing figures.
That's who I am. Now forget me, Rose Tyler.
And so, Adrian Hodges, the showrunner of Primeval, a dinosaur series that was a rival to Doctor Who on ITV, was brought in to revamp Survivors for a modern audience, based on Terry Nation's 1970s spin-off novel.
We're talking more than 90% of the world's population.
That way of life is gone now. Mobile phones, computers, the electricity that powers them, all gone for good.
I enjoyed it when I watched it in 2008 and 2010, which is when the 2 seasons of 6 episodes went out. I've just watched it again. This time I'm able to compare it to the 70s version, and I suppose the big difference is that the character of Tom Price is no longer a middle-aged tramp. He is a handsome young escaped convict who has murdered people in the past and has ambiguous motivations. I didn't enjoy it so much this time, and maybe that's just my feeling about modern British TV. The thing that was annoying me most, and this is a criticism that's often levelled at modern Doctor Who as well, was the bombastic, distracting music that was underscoring every emotion. And someone pointed out to me that 1970s Survivors didn't have incidental music in it, which gave it a sort of otherworldly quality. And there was the whole series arc about the wicked scientists who created the virus and you know the kind of thing. The 70s series has British understatement running right through it. Some people might find it slow. I think it's absorbing. And at the time of me making this video, it's all on YouTube. So you know what to do. Thank you for watching this video. If you would like to like and subscribe, that would be lovely.